Welcome to this session by the Social Work Registration Board of South Australia regarding competence and conduct. I'd like to introduce our speaker, who you know is Professor Sarah Wendt. She is the Director of the Social Workers Registration Board here in South Australia. My name's Louise Butler and I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the Social Workers Registration Board. I'm about to hand over to Sarah. She's going to go through all of the areas of conduct and competency. Before I do, I would like to really encourage people to have a look on the website. There's a great deal of information and details about conduct and competency. And it's important to listen when Sarah's speaking to remember that conduct and competency underpins and guides us in a lot of the work we will be doing in the regulatory space. So I won't take up any more of your time and I'll hand over to Sarah. So over to you, Sarah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Louise. Lovely to see you all again. Before I begin, it is important that we acknowledge, well, I acknowledge that I'm on Kaurna land and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. It's also really important to acknowledge and respect that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the First Nations people of this country and recognising them as the traditional owners and occupants of Australian land and waters. It is important that social work recognises the colonial past and the impact that this has had on First Nations people in the past and continues today. But equally, it's really important to acknowledge the strong and enduring connection to land and culture for First Nations people across this country. So today, we're going to be talking about conduct and competence. And so to tell you the story of conduct and competence, I want to begin with the Act, the purpose of regulation and the purpose of our Act and why conduct and competency sit in the Act. Then I want to spend a little bit of time with you to explain what do we actually really mean by conduct and competence. That's really important to get one's head around, but also not in just a definitional sense, but conduct and competence actually inform the regulatory framework. That means it actually has a relationship with registration, it has a relationship with education, and when we look at concerns and or investigations. And I want to explain that to you. So at the end of this piece with you, it's important that we understand that conduct and competence are really important pillars of registration or the regulatory environment. I'll also finish by just sharing with you with a couple of examples when there has been misconduct or incompetence, just so that you can see the kind of threshold that a regulator concentrates on. And we will have a bit of time at the end to also pose some questions. Also, our question and answer function is open online, so please do pop your questions in there because we have staff that can answer those questions in real time for you, but also they'll be looking at the questions that perhaps they can pose to me at the end. And of course, if we ever run out of time or we need a bit more thought on questions, we will post them through our frequently asked questions on our website, LinkedIn or newsletter. So let's get underway and just remind ourselves, what is the purpose of regulation? So, of course, the purpose of professional regulation is to protect the public. And we protect the public through supporting the quality and integrity of a profession. So when you think about regulation, it exists to create trust that people providing specialised services, you know, like law, like teaching, and now social work, are actually competent, accountable, and safe to do so. What regulation also does is it can restrict the use of a professional title. So things like lawyer, psychologist, nurse, we get to protect the title now of social work. And so when you protect a title, you also have the opportunity to reserve certain tasks that are only for qualified practitioners. And so you can see that in our past presentations when we've been talking a lot about the scope of practice and the definition of a protected piece of work. is our social work service definition. But also, the professional needs to know what conduct and competencies actually speak to this scope and speak to this definition, and therefore how they are held to account to actually hold that title and do pieces of work within the scope and the definition. Also, most importantly, it's if you're going to have a scope and a definition, this needs to be taught. And so conduct and competency become really important pillars that surround this and also set the precedents for how things are to be taught. So it gives me great pleasure to talk to you about these two big pillars of registration. Before we jump into it, I also just want to remind people that when we say regulation is public safety, what we're also making a statement about is this is about improving the quality of practice. It's an opportunity to come together as a collective and say, this is who we are as social workers, this is what we do, and this is how we do it. It's the value that we are offering society. So I just want to remind people that regulation, or when we talk about conduct and competence, is actually much bigger than an investigation, and it's not about going after or punishing people. Conduct and competence is about elevation of the profession, actually for the public good. So that's also what we mean by protecting the public. So let's have a look at our Act. So we always go back to the Act as a regulator. That's what guides our work. And so you might be wondering, where did they get this conduct and competency thing from? Well, it's in our Act. So the primary objective of our Act, and I've just popped it up there for everyone to have a read, is to encourage the maintenance of high professional standards of both competence and conduct by registered social workers. There they are. They're the two big pillars that need defining and understanding. And so the other primary objective of our Act is to ensure that registered social workers are held accountable professionally for the conduct of their practice. So as a regulatory office and as a regulatory board, we need to be really clear what we mean by competence and conduct, because that's what that's what social workers are held to account for. So let's go to a definition first. So let's have a look at competence, and I'm going to show you each one of these in a bit more detail, but let's just start with conduct. Conduct, when we say conduct, what we're actually meaning is standards of behaviour. Okay, so we're talking about behaviour, what you would reasonably expect how a professional would behave. So it's standards of behaviour and practice that we consider ethical and professional. And these are core requirements of providing professional, safe and effective services. Often conduct is also about the minimum standards of appropriate behaviour that we would expect while acting in a professional capacity. So think of conduct as someone's behaviour. Competence, however, is the ability to integrate and apply contextually appropriate knowledge, skills and values to consistently perform successfully in one's profession. So that's really key. There is an assumption there to be competent. There are particular knowledge, skills and values that you must hold as a social worker to be able to perform your role successfully. Competence is often made up of multiple competencies. Okay, so we have 7 competencies that we have published. And so when you think about these multiple competencies, they come together like a cluster. And it's this coherent cluster of knowledge, skills and values that are required to do the work of a social worker. It's the interaction between these, the bringing together of knowledge, skills and values that equals competencies or competent. So competencies are also meant to be transferable across different situations, settings and environments. So that's what we mean by conduct. It's the behaviour that we would expect of a social worker. Competence is the knowledge, skills and values that we expect a social worker to have to consistently perform successfully in their role. So often, I also just want to point out that the Social Workers Registration Board, of course, has endorsed the Code of Ethics. And so we do have a Code of Ethics that the AASW has led. I want you to think about the Code of Ethics as a formal set of principles or guidelines that set out a standard. So codes of ethics often reach for a good standard, a good practice, whereas a code of conduct is a standard that's for the purpose of regulation. And with regulation, we need to be really clear that and focused when we define competence and conduct. This is really important in a regulatory space because people are held to account for their competence and for their conduct. So it's only fair that we're really clear what we mean by this. And the other reason why we need to be really clear what we mean by this is because they have such a strong relationship to education, registration, and concerns and investigations. And I want to talk to you about that. But before we do that, let's have a look at our conduct and our competence. So here at the Registration Board, we have produced and published the Code of Conduct, and you're more than welcome to have a look at that on our website. Remember, the purpose of a Code of Conduct, the Act asks us to produce a Code of Conduct. So here we are articulating the desired behaviours to establish standards for the professional and safe provision of services. This code of conduct that we've produced has been informed by the Code of Ethics, the big umbrella, and it sets out the base minimum expectations and standards of behaviour that we would require of a registered social worker. It's consistent with our legislative responsibility for public protection. And so the code establishes a standard for professional conduct against which performance can be assessed for the purpose of regulating the profession. So that becomes really important in a regulatory space. So if you have a look at the 7 that we have named here, firstly, we are saying that conduct, we expect social workers to act with integrity, respect and honesty in all the dealings with with service users, colleagues and other professionals, that they display, a standard of personal and professional behaviour that actually warrants the trust and respect of the profession and the community. So there's that respect piece and that trust piece. We also are saying that we expect that social workers will protect the rights, interests and privacy of service users. And so here comes the importance of maintaining clear and appropriate professional boundaries and relationships with service users, for example, maintaining privacy and confidentiality, respecting the cultural needs of service users. There's some examples of that. We are also expecting that social workers be accountable to service users, employers, peers and relevant others. And so often accountability in this space of being accountable to is things like maintaining accurate records for all contact and dealings with service users, ensuring that you're storing all data ethically and confidentially. And that you're using technology safely and ethically. So there's some other examples. In terms of conduct, we would also expect that social workers act in accordance with the law, so with relevant regulations, policies and procedures. So it's really important that social workers comply with all these things, know what they are and that's relevant in terms of their employment. It also means to comply and cooperate with the regulatory responsibilities when you are being registered. What else would we expect in terms of behaviour? That social workers manage risk appropriately. So again, it's important here that you prioritise the safety of service users and their families. The safety becomes really paramount, and that you're able to, for example, identify conflicts of interest and be able to handle those things. So there's just some other examples. 2 more, we would expect that social workers know how to work within the limits of their own competence and capacity. So this is really important that social workers can consult and seek advice or support under supervision. If they don't know something, they seek it out. Also that they have the ability to recognise changes to their own physical or mental health capacity and that they can make sound judgments about that. So that's really about, social workers taking responsibility for their own competence and capacity. And lastly, that social workers also take responsibility for their professional development and maintaining competence. So this is, about keeping currency to the relevant knowledge and skills, through supervision, CPD opportunities, etc. So that's our code of conduct, and you're more than welcome to go and have a look at it in more detail on our website. We also have what we call our core competencies. So again, we have established 7 core competencies. And on the screen at the moment, you'll see that we have 7 high-level competencies that what we are saying come together as a collective to make up competence, the competent social worker. We have taken these things from, and they have been informed by, the Code of Ethics and the practice standards of the AASW, but our core competencies represent the essential elements that together constitute social work competence for the purpose of regulation. These competencies also provide a critical foundation for understanding and assessing both competence and unprofessional conduct in social work, particularly in the context of fitness to practice considerations. When we have named these, if you go onto the website, you'll notice that each one of these 7 competencies have been made up or aligned to particular knowledge, skills, and values that we would expect a social worker has competence in. So I'm just going to give you an example because you can read through this on the website and come back and ask us any questions you like about it. But for example, if I say that a social worker needs to be competent in ethics and integrity, what that means is I'm saying a social worker is accountable and practices ethically and professionally. So then we ask ourselves the question, what knowledge would a social worker require? And so it could be things like the AASW Code of Ethics, understanding self-awareness, understanding the importance of values, morals and ethics in social work knowledge, understanding the politics of identity in social work, understanding duty of care issues, or, for example, understanding colonisation and the historic and ongoing impact on First Nations peoples. So that could be the knowledge that sits under building your competency in ethics and integrity. What might be some of the skills? It would be, for example, self-awareness, learning self-awareness, reflective practice, reflection on practice. It might be cultural sensitivity, but it also might mean record keeping, case noting and documentation. What would be some of the values that we would teach under ethics and integrity? It would be things like respect for persons, professional integrity, honesty, trustworthiness, etc., accountability and service to service users. So what you do when you name a competence is that you can build knowledge, skills and values around speaking to that competency area, which becomes really important when you start to teach social work and what's expected of a social worker. So I encourage you to read through those 7 core competencies because coming together, we say that makes the social work competent. You might also want to see what we've listed. So this is not an exhaustive list on our websites. It's an indicative list. And so if you feel really strongly that there's something in there that you think makes up social work competence or competencies, please let us know and we can have a conversation about it. So why am I going on about conduct and competence? Because the Act requires it, but also conduct and competence gives us a real opportunity, again, to look at social work identity, okay? So in developing these competencies, we've made a real conscious decision to move away from tasks or actions, like trying to list as many tasks or things that social workers must know. So instead, we are taking a focus on knowledge, skills and values that make up the competence of a social worker. And this sits alongside forming a social work identity. When you do this, this recognises that competencies actually cut across specific tasks or settings, whereas it actually represents a way of thinking, a way of knowing and doing. This is really important because tasks, such as assessment, might be done differently or take a different form in a different workplace. So, for example, nurses might do it differently. Psychologists do it differently because they're coming from their own thinking, knowing and doing. It is our chance to say what we think social work is in its knowing and its thinking and its doing that makes assessment in a particular way. So this is what makes social work social work. The social work competencies, they come together to also inform and influence what we think about social work identity. So it's the how we think about and do things that make competency the building blocks of competence. And that for me equals social work. That's what makes us unique. So also remember, conduct sits next to competencies as well, but it's the behaviour, it's the expression of a professional. So let's have a look at now the actual relationship that conduct and competency has with education, registration, concerns and investigations. It's really important to understand this because conduct and competency don't sit out on their own. Their definitions and their understanding inform all these things. And that's why we really also welcome any thoughts around what might be missing in our competency that you would like to be seen. And we can have a conversation about that. So let's start with education. So if you have conduct competency, they have a very strong relationship with education. So when you set conduct and competency as a regulator, it's also important to start turning your attention to education standards because these education standards establish a baseline, a requirement for social work education in South Australia. So we're going to have to turn our minds to this. As a foundational resource for educators and other stakeholders, education standards represent the key expectation of education providers, the universities, in the design and delivery of quality programs and registered social workers as providers of safe, competent and ethical services. So at the moment, if you don't know, the Australian Association of Social Workers set the education standards and accredits the universities. In the future, we will need to think about education standards that align with regulation. This is really important because when you set conduct and competency to which people are being held to account, you need to be able to teach those things, set people up for success so that they know what they're being held to account for. Every other regulator, including those in APRA, have a separate independent accreditator that works on behalf of a board, and then the board approves the accreditation. So what I'm also saying is that regulation provides us with an opportunity to look at the education standards as a sector together, as a collective together, and think to ourselves as key stakeholders, what do we expect for people to be work ready in social work? This is really exciting. This is an exciting time that registration provides us. So what I'm saying is registration is not a process that sits outside the profession. It's a professional issue and responsibility, and registration alone cannot improve practice. We need education leaders to enable the uplift also of the practice of social workers and the standards. So there is a natural connection between regulation and accreditation. So when we look at regulation, it gives us a real opportunity to answer what are we trying to achieve and why as social workers? And what will students need to know, think and be able to do to become a social worker? And so with the advent of regulation, the scope of practice and the social work service definition becomes really important here and how we think about those things, but also how we think about conduct and competency. So also, when we're thinking about education and we're thinking about a regulatory framework, we have also aligned ourselves with an outcomes-focused approach. So we are wanting to adopt this approach to education of social workers because we are interested in education standards that specify what graduates must be able to know, do and demonstrate at the end of their training, rather than just describing things that they need to be taught. So I want you to have a think about that. And and I pose this question to you also, that this is an opportunity for you as social workers, as employers, or perhaps service users. What do you think is important to consider when educating the future social workers? So I've just popped this up here just to explain to people that education standards become really important in a regulatory environment, because they can set standards across particular domains. And we've started to think about this. And so you'll see in domain 3 and 4, the things that we really need to think through in terms of setting people up for success to be able to achieve the core competencies. And that sits often in the program of study, the student experience, and the field education requirements of social workers. Also, as a regulator, we can look at the governance in terms of quality assurance and processes being effective in terms of running programs, and always keeping an eye on public safety. So education standards gives us a real opportunity when we look at a regulatory environment. So conduct and competency have a really strong relationship with education. But it also has a really strong relationship with registration. So to be eligible to register under the Social Workers Registration Board and in any other regulator, you need a prescribed qualification to be eligible to register. Ours also has the provision of a competence developed through practical experience. But what you need is a qualification, which is really important, hence education standards or any kind of competency test or assessment. You need working with children check, a national criminal history check, and also a fit and proper person check. And so again, my message is conduct and competency have a relationship with registration because of the qualification and the teaching, but also because of the fit and proper person declaration that's also required. So I do just want to also share with you the fit and proper declaration, and again reassure people that we won't be asking for anything more that's in the Act. So our fit and proper declaration at the start of registration, which aligns with conduct and competence, will ask questions around communication, character and reputation, compliance with law, health considerations, and professional standards and conduct. So again, you can see conduct and competency sits in the fit and proper. That's why conduct and competency have a strong relationship with registration. I also just want to reassure people, just because you might answer yes to any one of these things, this does not automatically deny you registration, okay? This is just an opportunity to perhaps have a conversation with one of the regulatory officers when you're registering about why you ticked yes. It does not automatically mean that you do not become registered. Also, we will never be asking for an English language test. If you have a degree or an employer endorsement, we are assuming that you are competent. Overseas degrees come with a letter from the ASW, so we will not require any further proof. So I just want to reassure people we are not asking of anything other than what the ASW already asks. Also, so what I've shared with you is that conduct and competence has a real opportunity and relationship with thinking about future education and education standards of social workers. Conduct and competence have a relationship with registration because it talks about the importance of the education, but also the fit and proper declaration. But similarly, conduct and competency become the two big pillars in which concerns can be raised about a social worker and investigations then become possible. So it's really important that we understand what these two things mean and how they relate to concerns and investigations. So just a reminder that the legislation allows for a concern to be made against the registered social worker to the board by different key stakeholders. The registrar to be appointed can raise a concern with the board. The minister can raise a concern. An employer of a person can raise a concern. A person aggrieved by the conduct which in competency sits in there, of the social workers, registration, the conduct and competency of a social worker can also raise a concern. And any other person who satisfies the board, they have sufficient interest in the matter. So that's come from the Act. So these are all the different key stakeholders that can raise particular concerns. Also, though, just because a concern is raised doesn't mean that the Social Workers Registration Board will be picking up every concern. We need to look at and reply to every concern, but not all concerns will move towards investigations. And so the legislation also notes that the following are cause for disciplinary action against a social worker. And so leading down into an investigation, these are some of the things that the legislation lists where it might become possible. So, for example, if registration was improperly obtained, the board would be investigating that. If the person is guilty of unprofessional conduct, which includes incompetence, we might want to have a look at that. If a working with children check has not been conducted, we would need to look at that. If the person for any other reason is no longer a fit and proper person to be registered, we'd need to be looking at that. So it's these things that would be grounds for investigation. So it's really important to also note that employers also have a responsibility in terms of offering supervision, CPD, managing their own performance issues, their own internal workplace issues. The regulator cannot step into everything that's raised. The regulator will always be informed by the legislation in terms of what it will investigate. So there are some outcomes that often come from registration. And the board is also clear in terms of what outcomes it can undertake, which is informed by the legislation. So these are some of the things that come from the Act. So just because the board looks into concerns or investigates a concern, it does not automatically mean that someone is deregistered. So the board can censure someone. The board might be able to fine someone. The board could put conditions on a social worker's registration. The board also might have the power to suspend a social worker's registration. But at the most far end, the board can cancel or disqualify someone's registration. And so those ones in italics there, that's basically what we're calling the deregistration of a social worker. The others is not deregistration. We can put conditions on or monitor or support social workers. So again, my message is, if the board has such influence under the legislation, we need to be really clear what we mean by conduct and competence. So when a concern comes in, or if a decision is to be made around an investigation, it will always be through the lens of conduct and competence for the board, because that's what the legislation requires us to do. So I also just wanted to, before we finish up, is share with you just some examples that we have seen most recently in New Zealand and England, just so that people get a bit of an idea of what do we mean by examples of misconduct or incompetence. And so often though, I've separated these to misconduct and incompetence for the purpose of today's presentation, but often they also go hand in hand together, because our legislation says incompetence is misconduct. So, but if we have a look at, again, those definitions that we showed you earlier, remember conduct's behaviour, and remember competence is the knowledge, skills and values that one would expect a social worker to have to be competent. So I've popped up two there in misconduct where there was an actual hearing. So it went right through to an investigation where a hearing was undertaken by the board in New Zealand. And so there was a case against the social worker, theft, where the social worker stole from the employer. There was a criminal conviction that was done. So what the New Zealand Registration Board decided was to cancel that registration of that social worker through a hearing. So there was a criminal conviction, and so that was fairly straightforward. You'll also, to give you another example, though, the New Zealand also cancelled a social worker's registration through a hearing, but this wasn't a criminal conviction. So, like theft is a criminal conviction, so that person was charged. This was an example where there was an inappropriate relationship where there was a man who fathered children with the mother who was his client. And so there's no criminal conviction to that, but there was a hearing and the New Zealand Registration Board deregistered that social worker for an inappropriate relationship. There can be other things where you can have a conviction. So, for example, in England, there's been some convictions of drink driving, but that didn't automatically deregister a social worker. That's because the social worker self-reported it, came and told the board, and so that person has been given a warning for 3 years. So the warning sits on the registration, but if they do it again, then the board can look at other different forms of conditions or sanctions. Similarly, there was a case recently in England where a social worker asked a client for a kiss and the employer dismissed that social worker for gross misconduct and reported it to the board. The board investigated it. The social worker was very remorseful and they were given a warning on their registration for 5 years that should any of that behaviour happen again, there would be more different consequences. So you can see that conduct can be criminal or non-criminal, but the registration board can investigate either through hearings or not and can have different forms of outcomes available to them. Just to show you something a little bit different that's not sitting in behaviour or criminal behaviour, if we go to incompetence, I've just pulled these two to show you. There was a case in England recently where a social worker was investigated for failure to maintain accurate and or up-to-date records. In actual fact, because they were so behind in them, they started to falsify those case records. And so the England board did a removal order, so removed them off of registration and said they could reapply in 5 years. So they were deregistered and could only reapply for registration 5 years later. So that goes to incompetence in terms of failure to maintain records, up-to-date records, and then falsifying those case records. Similarly, England found another case where there was a social worker who was showing poor performance and serious data breach. So again, they were experiencing failure to complete statutory assessments that were needed. They didn't follow any actions or follow-ups from any assessments, and they actually started to expose confidential case data to other people. So you can see that there are multiple forms of incompetence here. This person, in actual fact, had conditions put on their practice for 18 months and was monitored closely. So there can be different outcomes for different social workers depending on the actual case. To provide you with a slightly different example, when there is a health condition where this impacts someone's practice, this one in England was also looked at recently, where someone's health deteriorated significantly, but there was a failure to keep the employer informed about those ongoing health issues. The practice became so unsafe that the board asked for a medical assessment, which was prepared for the regulator. And so after that, conditions were placed on the practice of that person for the next 3 years. So some have been deregistered, others haven't. Some have been criminal convictions, others haven't. But that just gives you an idea of the threshold in which England and New Zealand look at concerns and investigations. So some concluding points. So after talking to you about conduct and competence, I hope that you can actually see that these are the two central pillars in professional regulation, because those two pillars are about protecting the public, upholding trust, and maintaining credibility of a profession. And that's what registration does. But also conduct and competence, they actually have the power to influence and shape how professionals are educated and therefore how social workers are prepared for the workforce. Regulation therefore balances what practitioners can do, how they do it, and so you see there both competence and conduct. So it's really important that we understand what we expect of social workers and how we expect that they will behave while doing their work. It's these things that they are held to account for. Also, conduct and competence are really important because they are the central reference points for investigations in a regulated profession, because it's these things, these two things, that provide the framework for regulators to use to decide whether a practitioner's behaviour or practice meets the professional standards. And that's ultimately what has a decision on their registration status. So if you wanted to follow up with any of this, I just want to reassure you that our Code of Conduct and our 7 core competencies have been influenced by the Code of Ethics of the AASW and the practice standards, but we need them for a regulatory environment. So we need to be really clear for and about them. And similarly, the practice of outcomes focused and understanding competencies has been researched. So there's some references for you to have a look at. But again, we always welcome your questions. So I might finish there.